Some say that justice is blind, but we don't think those who are protecting the law should also be. Even though we would all like to feel that we are in the care of the best and the brightest, this isn't always the case. Like with any other job, cops can sometimes make huge mistakes. Today, we take a look at a list of videos that will show us what happens when cops mess with the wrong suspect. Number 1. A foreign driver doesn't allow himself to be bullied by a cop. Let's start by reviewing one of the experiences that many of us who drive could have easily encountered. Getting pulled over by cops isn't something that should be scary in itself. However, the cop's politeness and approach do have to be appropriate if we haven't done anything wrong. This cop seems to believe that wearing a uniform gives him the right to do things how he pleases and place unreasonable demands in front of the civilians. In this case, the civilian didn't budge and decided to teach him a lesson. After the cop has pulled over this man, he asks him to roll down his window entirely. However, being a man of principle, the driver wants to take things slow and go step by step, and he asks for an explanation regarding why he was pulled over. Now, there could have been many ways to explain why this guy was pulled over, but the cop decided to go with a hilarious answer to this question. He told the man that they had seen him screaming at the cops as he drove next to them. Still, this doesn't seem logical to the citizen, and he keeps asking questions. All of this just gave this cop an opportunity to make matters even worse for himself by saying that he wanted to check whether this foreign driver needed some help. Since this made no sense, the driver calmly proceeded to show the cop his ID by placing it directly on the glass and still refusing to roll down his window since he saw no point in it or need for it. This apparently just further irritates the cop, who keeps threatening the driver with various consequences for not doing what he says. The civilian, however, seems to know how to talk to cops and explains to him that freedom of speech is what gives him the right to even yell if necessary. Not only that, but since there's no valid reason, it is within his rights to refuse to open the window for the officer. This cop, however, doesn't seem to know when he should give up. Being desperate to pull one over the driver, he keeps inventing excuses such as the window needs to be open so he can check for weapons and that he can even smell alcohol, which is nonsense considering the window is entirely closed. Seeing as the driver doesn't budge, the cop is left with nothing but the rage that was a reward for his rude behavior. Recognizing this, the smart driver proceeds to ensure that he doesn't get tricked by this police officer and asks for information. These included not just the cop's name, but also if there was to be a ticket, he wanted the ticket number. This further enrages the cop as he knows that once the driver has these things, there isn't much that the cop can do, and we see him even refusing to show his name clearly to the driver. As their interaction was ending, the cop made a few more moves that clearly showed he had messed with the wrong suspect. After showing more documentation and the car insurance, at one point, the driver opened the car door. Even though it wasn't caught on camera, the cop apparently reached for his gun. The wise driver, however, decided not to push his luck, got back in the car, and went on his merry way with just a ticket. Number 2. A cop messed with the wrong journalist. It certainly isn't just drivers that occasionally end up being a target of rude behavior and unreasonable demands. When working as a journalist, one can cross paths with various officers of the law who can be unsupportive and quite hateful of one's trade. In this next case, we will see how a journalist has come in front of a police department building to work on his story and build a report. He is then faced by a cop who seems to believe that this reporter is quite a naive one. Very soon, this cop learns that not only does this reporter do his job, but he is also knowledgeable about what he can and can't do in front of the police. The officer approached the man at the beginning and told him that he was on private property and that this was why he had no right to be filming around. Let's see how the journalist pulls out of this one. Starting by going directly to the point, the reporter asks this officer whether there's a supervisor he can speak to and avoid having to deal with this man who obviously needs some notes on what he can and can't demand of the journalist. Since the cop refused to provide such a contact, the journalist immediately relies on the Fifth Amendment and tells him that he refuses to talk. These two cunning answers from the journalist seem to immediately put the officer in another mood, and he starts threatening the man that he will be detained. The journalist, however, remains calm and explains to him that he can't detain him, considering he is on public property and not doing anything wrong. However, since the cop keeps insisting that he is right and that the man can't be here, the journalist once again shows that he is indeed knowledgeable about his rights. After being asked for his full name, he refuses and instead demands the cop to reach out to his supervisor. Once the cop plays dumb, this reporter continues filming him for the whole time and asks a crucial question. His question was whether this interaction that he was recording was a consensual one or if this cop was trying to use some law that gave him the right to walk up to the journalist and act this way toward him. This must have been a wake-up call for this cop, who got a clearer picture and realized that he wasn't dealing with just any civilian. Nevertheless, trying to support his demands with an explanation, he says that a reporter can't be filming around here because, in the police facility, there are not just law enforcers but also inmates. He even compared the station to the Pentagon, but all of these big words did nothing to the journalist's confidence in his knowledge. The reporter then proceeds to work on his story, but is still bothered by this police officer who doesn't want to give in and provide the supervisor's contact information. What he does want, though, is to chase the reporter away, threatening with detention. Since the cop has been kind of asking for it, the journalist decided to give him a lesson in law. The police officer keeps claiming that he can arrest this man because he didn't provide an ID and even references a specific law. Hilariously, the journalist shows him that he knows this law better than the cop and explains to him that this is only the case if a crime has been committed, which isn't what's happening here. Another lesson that the cop had to learn was the difference between private and public property. We can agree that this cop was unprepared to deal with this suspect who outsmarted him. Number 3, a man wins a game of patience against a police officer. We have seen that one amazing advantage that a person can have in interactions with rude cops is knowing your own rights. This next case reveals a man who is so knowledgeable and confident in his understanding of the law that we don't even see him change his expression throughout this whole unpleasant experience. This incident started when this knowledgeable man parked his car in a non-designated parking space, and the cop felt he could lean on the man just because this space was within a private parking lot. If you feel from this setup that there could be some fault with what the driver has done, watch what happens as the cop approaches him. Once the cop walked up to the driver and asked for the man's name, he didn't mind giving it. Since he noticed that this officer was somewhat confused and made quite long and awkward pauses, the driver right away asked the police officer whether he had to answer any of the questions that he was being asked. The cop shows his attitude right away, saying that the driver isn't obliged to do so, but that he doesn't mind standing in front of his vehicle the whole day if needed. Refusing to be threatened in such a way, the man politely asks the cop to finish up any business that he may have and leave him so he can continue with his job. The cop, however, isn't pleased with such an attitude and claims that the man is being aggressive, even though we see from the driver's face that this isn't the case and that assertiveness and knowing one's rights shouldn't be declared aggressive. The cop also adds that this is a parking space and that he is even going easy on the driver. Once again, not allowing himself to fall for such a trick, the man tells the cop that he isn't being aggressive and would just like to be left alone, as this interaction is turning into harassment. Since this doesn't change the cop's approach, the driver politely asks whether he is free to leave or if he is being detained. The cop then claims that he, in fact, is detained, but we see that this doesn't confuse the driver at all. He accepts these new claims from the police officers and proceeds accordingly. Instead of panicking, he sticks with the idea that he doesn't have to answer any of the cop's questions. We see him patiently waiting for the cop to give up. This, however, doesn't happen, and after being reminded multiple times that this driver doesn't want to answer any questions if he doesn't have to, the cop starts showing frustration. We can understand that this must come from the fact that this police officer knows he has no right to demand interaction, so he resorts to some dirty tricks. For starters, he claims that the man is illegally parked at a private parking spot, and not just that, but that he is obstructing traffic. This isn't true, as even during this video, we could have noticed cars passing by in the background. Deciding to end this situation, the driver says that he will accept a parking ticket if the cop is willing to put a stop to this harassment. But since we have already seen his true colors, we could have guessed that the cop won't let this be easy. Instead of doing it immediately, the cop decided to complicate the process and take more of the driver's time. He says they have to wait for other officers to come and write up the ticket, and proceeds to be rude even as they await their arrival. Still bugging the man with questions, the cop even calls his behavior hostile, which we all witnessed wasn't true. We see that quite a lot of time has passed, but it just demonstrates this driver's nerves of steel. After quite some time, even the cop got tired of waiting and became impatient. Seeing this and not wanting to lose the whole day, the man asks the officer what he needs to do so he can get his documents back and be set free to go about his business. The officer, however, doesn't use this opportunity to end the situation. Instead, he insists that the man needs to answer his inquiries so that he would be let go. The man, once again, refuses to be blackmailed into answering questions when he isn't obliged to by law and hasn't done anything wrong. It would seem that the cop realized the relentless will of this driver not to give in to this undeserved pressure. The cop finally decides to hand over the driver's papers and let him go. Staying cautious, the driver finally asks for verbal confirmation that he is free to leave, and after getting a positive answer, he drives away. Number 4. A cop tries to provoke an armed suspect. By now, we have seen cases where cops have messed with the wrong suspects who weren't going to let them do how they please. In the next video, we will see a man who was harassed with more serious accusations. Namely, this man was put in a tough spot because of possessing a firearm. As soon as the man walks up to the rally, a police officer walks straight up to him. Even from the way that she walks, we can see that she has taken the situation very seriously. The man decides not to stop and keeps on walking. We see the officer following right along. Immediately, these two start arguing. While the officer claims it isn't allowed, the man declares that wearing a pistol on Capitol grounds is entirely within his rights. Indeed, this is a bold move, telling a cop off while you are wearing a gun. But we must remember that this person is wearing a firearm, so they must be very informed about their lawful obligations. Even if the law allows wearing a pistol on Capitol grounds, this officer seems unaware of it. It shows us that she needs to update her knowledge on the topic, especially if she patrols around places where this kind of thing could happen. She seems baffled by the man's decision not to stick around and talk to her, and she even cuts off his path to make him wait. The woman gets quite frisky and starts pushing the man and threatening him with an arrest. This is when the gentleman makes another bold move. He calls out the female officer, telling her that she needs to stop handling him or he will be forced to defend himself. Considering he has a gun on him, this is definitely a serious thing to say. Even though the woman seems to understand what he is saying, she keeps the attitude and even dares him to do so. What a bad move for an officer of law. Simply put, we see her almost daring a man to break the law. And what's worse, she is essentially provoking what could be a gunfight. The gun owner keeps his composure, and the raging female officer gets pulled away from the situation by an experienced cop who probably has a better grip on what's allowed and what isn't. Number 5. A lesson in how to stand up for yourself. We have seen that even when you know you are right, you sometimes have to hold your ground firmly. In this next video, we will see another such example. A man was pulled over by a cop who didn't seem to have a good enough reason to do so. Once the driver stopped, he was told that he was suspected of driving over the limit, which he knew for a fact wasn't true. The man then even explains to the officer that he saw the cops from afar and that he can't imagine any driver would be dumb enough to go speeding next to them. We aren't sure what this cop's idea was, but soon after, his supervisor shows up and realizes that they can't keep this man for no reason. So he is released. Number 6. A man refuses to be treated as a suspect. Similar to the previous video, the next one we check out also shows how important it is for cops to update their legal knowledge occasionally. In 2018, a 911 call took a police officer to this neighborhood. The man, who we see sitting calmly even in the first shots, immediately becomes a suspect in the cop's eyes. The cop walks up to the man and directly explains to him that he's being approached because of the 911 call that was made. As soon as they start talking, we can see that the cop is bent on blowing things out of proportion. The confused civilian asks him what it is that he has been doing wrong and what made the cop treat him in this way. Seeking an opportunity or a justification to bring this suspect to the station, the cop proceeds to seek a valid reason. He uses the call that was made as an excuse to toss around some wild accusations. However, the man doesn't give in and calmly asks to be left alone since he isn't bothering anyone in this neighborhood. To ensure nothing drastic happens, the man gets up and starts recording. As if he was trying to discourage him from doing so, the officer mentions that he has a body camera that will capture everything happening in this suspicious person's investigation. Even though he's being called suspicious, the man tries not to provoke a quarrel and calmly asks whether he is under arrest. After he confirms that he isn't under arrest, he asks the officer if this means that he doesn't have to be questioned in this manner and treated as a criminal under suspicion. Since he has decided not to allow this cop to do whatever he likes, the man tries to walk away and refuses to identify himself. The cop, however, doesn't react well to this and becomes domineering, claiming that the man cannot walk away. Knowing his rights, the man, however, reminds him that he is not under arrest and hasn't committed any crime, but the officer immediately calls for backup. This is clearly an overreaction. But since this doesn't cause the man to stop, the cop proceeds to threaten him with detention. As he explains, he wasn't done talking with this civilian, which is reason enough to arrest him. We can clearly see that this man has decided not to allow the cop to mistreat him, and he repeats multiple times that since he isn't being arrested, he doesn't have to stay there and tolerate this intrusive behavior of a cop. Even though the man was polite, we can see the officer still communicating to his colleagues that a person isn't cooperating in this investigation, making things sound more drastic than they truly are. At one point, this fellow has shown us that he can read the room quite well. As he senses that the cop is getting very irritated and threatening him more aggressively, he decides to stop briefly and once again confirm everything he has said. Another point that he has made is that he won't allow this cop to treat him as a suspect just because someone made a call about a suspicious person in that neighborhood. If that wasn't enough, he even twisted things around, saying that the cop may seem suspicious to him in the same way that the cop is treating him for no good reason. After making such a point, he proceeds to walk away, but the cop's ego doesn't seem to be able to accept this. The cop has decided to put cuffs on this man simply because he is walking away and doesn't accept the role of a suspect, even though the officer is pushing it on him. The smirk on the man's face as he was being cuffed should have been a sign to the cop that things wouldn't end the way he wanted them to. The cop then proceeds to lead this man throughout the whole street in cuffs, even though both his body cam and the man's phone have recorded the whole event, where we can all clearly see the pressure wasn't justified. After getting him to the police car, we see the cop taking everything out of the man's pockets and putting him in the back seat. As we could easily conclude, even though this officer couldn't, the man was not found guilty and was quickly released. Number 7. Cop tries to trick a lawyer. We have seen a few examples of cops who tried to make things into bigger trouble than they truly are. The cop from the following video will find out that not everyone who they suspect will give in easily. This man was pulled over because a cop had an observation regarding the lights above his back license plates. According to him, the tag lights on this car weren't functioning properly and didn't make the plates visible. Besides that, it could be troubling for someone to drive behind this car. In this cop's mind, this was enough to request something as intrusive as searching the vehicle, but his plans were cut short. A detail that the cop didn't know was that the man behind the wheel was an attorney and that he definitely knew what was within his rights. A simple but firm no is what solves the situation. We can even see the driver smiling as he refuses the cop's wish to search the vehicle. Only after that does the cop acknowledge that to do so, he requires the driver's consent. The driver makes sure there is no cause for suspicion and tells the cop there is nothing in the vehicle. This unfair attempt to make it seem like the driver was obliged to listen to the cop failed, and the man was let go. Now that we have reviewed this list of cases in which cops have messed with the wrong suspects, we could ask ourselves if there is a lesson to be learned. One thing that we can be certain of is that we should always keep our cool and ask rational questions that will help us understand the situation better. Once we understand why we are being treated as suspects, we can respond better and help solve the situation. Of course, we should remember that these cases aren't representative of all law enforcers and that we are responsible for behaving properly on all occasions.